4 farmers attending a protest planned. Tomorrow outside Parliament. 5 columns encircled Parliament. 234. Streets paralyzed. Over 1,800 tractors stormed London. And in just 14 minutes, the capital was placed under total siege. This is not a union negotiation. This is war between the farmers and the government. At 8:30 a.m., the highways into London were severed. At 8:54, the tractors breached Westminster. At 9:15, the tanks were on the streets. Witnesses reported over a dozen tanks aligned with these protesters. Suddenly, reports broke of a tank crushing a police van. Police refused to confirm this. The farmers didn't care. This was the beginning of the end. By 9:30 sharp, tractors began sealing off every entry and exit to the government quarter. Karma declared that anyone participating in the siege would face prison time. But the protesters had nothing left to lose. When you demand £400,000 from farmers earning barely $30,000 just to keep their land, you don't just crush a business. You surrender the nation's food security to balance a broken ledger. And after it, you're stripping assets from the people who feed the nation to fund benefits for new arrivals, effectively buying the next election win with the wreckage of British farming. By lunch, analysts estimated the damage at £82 million. Keirstarmer and Rachel Reeves see farmers as millionaires. Yes, their land is valuable, but in reality they earn pennies. While the main London's highways remain blocked by tractors, the unthinkable becomes possible. Food reserves in the capital supermarkets will last 2 to 3 days at most. Warehouses never plan for a city besieged by thousands of tractors. While Starmer remained silent, police platoon are fighting to stop tractors from driving straight into the Parliament session. Waves across the country took to the streets demanding Starmer's resignation and holding signs that read, "No farmers, no food." By evening, the government's worst nightmare materialized. Thousands of those the media branded as far-right groups flooded onto the streets, merged with the tractors and the tanks. It became a nuclear mix. Tonight isn't about a budget dispute. It's about who actually feeds this island and who holds the power to starve it. The columns that breached the M25 highway were not urban activists, and they were not weekend protesters. Many had driven hundreds of miles from the regions, forcing their heavy machinery through police lines that Starmer foolishly thought would hold. A TikTok clip reached 7.3 million views. It showed a police van trying to block tractors' convoy and face the immediate consequences 8 seconds later. The video was removed in 2 hours, labeled as a violence violations. Waves of protesters didn't come to lobby. They came to siege, a strategy that traces back to a rural population pushed into a corner by a tax policy designed to erase their existence. These weren't traffic jams. They were calculated strangle holds, logistical choke points to see how long the capital can survive without a supply chain before the government breaks. And tonight, Westminster learned something terrifying. Concrete barriers failed. Armored vans were pushed aside, and Starmer's administration watched in paralysis. Officers on the ground weren't unwilling to stop them. They were simply outmatched by 10-ton machines that do not feel the bite of a baton. In South London, a radio message reported, "Sector 15 is lost. We just can't stop them," requesting immediate deployment of military equipment. Protesters on the ground began firing fireworks directly at police shields. 123 arrests were made in Belfast. 2. Police vans were set on fire. Rumors of a possible declaration of martial law began to spread. Star is expected to make a statement in the morning. In central London, a police negotiation unit was deployed, but 200 MOA. Reports came in of 7 hospitalized officers. Everything was called off. The demands from the tractors are absolute. Total repeal of so-called agricultural property relief changes or the blockade remains. Slmer's cabinet looks at a spreadsheet and sees a £3 million asset that should be taxed. The farmer looks at that same land and sees a workplace that generates less than £30,000 in annual profit. The new 20% levy on assets over 1 million is not a tax on wealth. It is a tax on existence. Children are facing an immediate bill of £500,000 the moment a parent passes away. There is no cash reserve to pay this. The only option is to sell the fields, destroying the business and ending centuries of tradition. Next to Parliament, farmers denounce Starmer as a city accountant who understands nothing about British agriculture. Labour promised protection, but they have delivered a death sentence to the smallholder. Farmers are furious that their assets are being raided to plug budget holes caused by soaring welfare costs and asylum accommodation. They see their life's work being liquidated to pay for a state that despises them. This isn't about protecting tax havens for the elite. It is about saving the men who get up at 4 a.m. to feed the nation. Rachel Reeves calls it closing a loophole. The protesters call it state-sanctioned theft. Every tractor parked on Whitehall represents a business that will not survive April 2026 if this law stands. They are not asking for subsidies. They are demanding the right to pass their livelihood to their children without the state taking a fatal cut. The message is clear. Kill the tax or we kill the entire country's agriculture. Britain isn't just losing its food security. It's actively destroying it. Keirstarmer built his economic plan on one delusion, that he could raid the countryside to balance the books without consequences. Tonight proved how fatal that calculation was. When the state declares war on its own producers, it doesn't get revenue, it gets famine. The tractors choking. Tonight's capital came from farms. Starmer refuses to understand. The defiance echoing through Whitehall grew. Under tax burdens, Rachel Reeves refuses to lift. And the paralysis of the supply chain is the direct result of a chancellor who refuses to listen. Britain isn't being governed. Britain is being liquidated until it starves. For weeks, agricultural unions quietly raised the same desperate warning. These blockades are not political stunts. They are survival mechanisms. Footage from the M25 revealed the sheer scale of the mobilization unfolding like a military operation. The same heavy machinery used to harvest wheat now used to barricade exits. The same disciplined columns of truckers from Manchester joining the siege. And the same terrifying sight of vintage tanks rolling alongside tractors, leaving police utterly outmatched. These are not lobby groups. These are coordinated, desperate producers drawing a line in the mud against a policy that wipes them out. And the government knew the math. They have the land values. They have the profit margins. They know a £3 million farm generates less than $30,000 a year. But under karma, every one of those facts gets filed under the same label, taxable wealth. Britain used to tax based on profit. Now it taxes based on envy. That is how we reach this absurd reality. A radical activist Blocking a road for climate ideology. Offered tea de-escalated protected. A. Counter-protester at the Bell Hotel. Handled with community sensitivity. But a British farmer driving a tractor to save his family's legacy met with armored vans threatened with mass arrests and treated as a domestic threat. The countryside sees this double standard. The working class feels this betrayal. And tonight, the supply chain snapped under it. Because when a nation realizes the government cares more about grabbing cash than ensuring there is bread on the shelves, order evaporates faster than the food reserves. Tonight wasn't just a gridlock. It was a standoff. Several officers speaking anonymously revealed the panic inside the command room. How do we stop tanks? There is no protocol. They didn't lack manpower. They lacked the physics to move 10 tons of steel. Permission to clear the road means nothing when the road is walled off by heavy industry. When the government fears the people who feed them. When ministers hide because their policies have triggered a logistical collapse. A country stops being functional. It starts being besieged. And Britain tonight is being besieged slowly, methodically, completely. Karma built his budget on one message. Those with the broadest shoulders should pay. But that message has turned into something else. We will strip the assets of the working farmer to pay for the failures of the state. Every decision Starmer makes on this tax is filtered through one arrogance. That the farmers will just accept bankruptcy, not understanding that when you take everything from a man, he has nothing left to lose but his chains. Suddenly, something alarming happened. Truck drivers threatened to repeat the fuel crisis of 2000 year. If this happens, under Starmer, it could be the final nail in the coffin. Columns of trucks were seen heading toward London. These may not be empty threats. Farmers and truckers have a long-standing alliance. If the tractors continue blocking the government district and the truckers drain petrol stations across the country, it could trigger an immediate collapse of the economy. In 3 hours, masked groups began targeting police units that had been deployed to contain the unrest. They moved separately from the farmers and operated with their own agenda. Officers reported sudden waves of attacks coming from side streets. Patrol vans were struck by rocks and shattered glass. Several riot lines were forced to reposition under heavy pressure. Protesters in dark clothing surrounded police teams with no warning. They ignored the agricultural dispute entirely. Their focus was the border issue. They marched toward hotels previously used for migrant accommodation. The crowds demanded an immediate shutdown of all boat arrivals. Stop. The boats echoed through the alleys as police attempted to hold their perimeter. A second wave of masked demonstrators pushed through an unsecured junction in South Belfast. Save our kids were shouted repeatedly at officers, forming a defensive cordon. Multiple vans were hit with bottles and debris. Emergency crews struggled to access damaged vehicles. Police commanders reported fragmented communication across several districts. Surveillance teams identified independent clusters acting without coordination with any tractor groups. These clusters targeted locations unrelated to the original protest. Some officers were pulled back after losing control of nearby intersections. The masked groups escalated their tactics at unexpected speed. They attempted to surround hotel entrances in several barriers. Officers on the ground described the situation as volatile and unpredictable. Commands for reinforcement were issued repeatedly. Riot shields absorbed a barrage of makeshift projectiles. Stars briefing was postponed for another 3 hours, and so the tax raid continues unchecked. The tractor blockade hardens into a siege. The supply chain snaps because the government refuses to pivot, and Britain becomes hungrier with each hour. Star waits. He calls it fiscal fairness. The countryside calls it the end of an industry. The panic isn't just in the markets, it's in the households. Tonight, British families faced a brutal economic reality. The state will bankrupt a local producer for a budget line, but it will subsidize the very crisis draining the treasury. Your legacy can be taxed out of existence, but their mismanagement is protected at all costs. Class warfare divides a country faster than debt. And tonight, the fear wasn't in the farmers. It was in the ministers who realize they have provoked the people who feed them. This is how a food system disintegrates. Not through drought, but through arrogance. When the engines roared on the M25, every police command room across London looked to Downing Street for a plan. No plan existed. Instead, the Home Office issued a directive defined by total paralysis, one that officers described as surrender disguised as protocol. Maintain public order without engaging heavy machinery. Engaging heavy machinery. That is the sterile phrase now used to describe the impossible task of stopping vintage tanks and 10-ton harvesters driven by men who have nothing left to lose. The government didn't freeze because of the noise. It froze because the police realized a riot shield stops a brick, not a tractor. Multiple insiders from the Treasury leaked the same arrogance. Every plea from the agricultural sector is dismissed as the complaining of the wealthy. It doesn't matter if milk is dumped in the sewers. It doesn't matter if bread runs out, distribution hubs fail, or the economy bleeds. 82 million pounds every 4 hours. Whitehall's priority is not food security. It is revenue collection. Reeves's advisors have become so fixated on closing a tax loophole that they would rather see the shelves empty than admit they miscalculated the resolve of the rural working class. Britain is the first nation in the G7 where the government fears a farmer more than a recession. Tonight's siege was entirely predictable. DARA held 5 separate impact studies warning of mass insolvency, collapsing domestic production, mental health crisis in farming communities, the impossibility of paying the 20% levy without selling land, reliance on imports increasing, strategic vulnerability, and red flags regarding the fragility of just-in-time delivery systems. Each of these dossiers was flagged for urgent review. Starmer ignored all of them. Aides claimed the Prime Minister dismissed the risks because he believed the farmers would simply absorb the cost. Absorb the cost. Meanwhile, tankers are turning back from Manchester. Shelves are bare in Birmingham, and Londoners are told to ration food in a first world capital. The tragedy unfolding isn't just economic. It is cultural extinction by spreadsheet. By targeting the transfer of land, Labour is ensuring that the next generation of British farmers never takes the wheel. Young men and women who spent their childhoods in the mud are now walking away, knowing they cannot service a £600,000 tax bill on a break. Even business. The vultures are already circling. Global investment firms are watching the chaos with checkbooks, ready, waiting to buy up distressed British soil for pennies on the pound. Once the insolvencies begin, Starr isn't saving the economy. He is putting the English countryside up for auction to foreign bidders. And the hypocrisy of the net zero agenda is now undeniable. By bankrupting local producers, this government is forcing supermarkets to rely on carbon-heavy imports flown in from thousands of miles away. They are trading food security for a moral posture that collapses the moment the ports get blocked. The police response has only deepened the resentment. Footage from the embankment shows officers slashing tires on agricultural trailers, a tactic never employed against climate activists gluing themselves to the tarmac. It is a calculated escalation against a group the state believes will eventually obey the law, but they miscalculated the desperation. When you back a cornered animal, it bites. When you back a cornered farmer, he parks a 10-ton on plow on the Prime Minister's doorstep. The media calls this a disruption. The history books will call it the moment the countryside declared